Sorry, the video got cut. So this is a direct continuation of our discussion on Darwin's journey and his studies. Okay, so one of the most important observations that Darwin made was the distribution of species in the Galapagos. Okay, so he noticed that the animals on the different islands were very similar, with some differences, subtle differences that made them distinct species. Okay? And he also observed that these organisms were very similar to the ones that were found on mainland South America. So if you're not familiar, this is Ecuador. These are the Galapagos Islands, so around 1,000 kilometers away from the mainland. And it's not just one island. Okay, the Galapagos is an archipelago. And of course, his most famous observation was on the Galapagos finches. So Darwin noticed that the Galapagos finches were highly varied, especially in terms of beak shape, beak size. And he later on concluded that the size and shapes of these beaks were very closely related to their food preference. So, Darwin, using many of his observations, some of which we've already described, so he came up with his ideas on evolution. And some of the most notable ones are shown here, namely common descent, speciation, gradualism, and natural selection. So the idea of common descent proposed by Darwin states that all life on Earth, have a common ancestor, and that all of these life forms arose through the process of speciation. So yeah, related to this, speciation is the process by which organisms evolve and form distinct species. Of course, the processes that lead to speciation are very varied, and we'll discuss these later on. And then there's also the idea of gradualism. Okay, so Darwin knew that the Earth is ancient, stemming from the ideas that Charles Lyell, a geologist, proposed. Anyway, so the idea of gradualism states that changes that occur for the formation of new species happen over very long periods of time, with the changes happening in small increments or small steps. Of course, we now know that this is sometimes true and sometimes not. Evolution isn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily happen on a gradual pace. And one of the most notable of Darwin's ideas was that of natural selection. And this is what many of us are familiar with, that the organisms have favorable traits that match their current environments, and these organisms are more likely to survive and reproduce. And then these traits can then be passed on to offspring. But we'll discuss natural selection again in greater detail later on. Okay? And then, of course, Darwin's idea of evolution is very close to what we believe now. Okay? But with some additions, right? So many of Darwin's ideas were further expanded, and many modern ideas have been incorporated into his ideas. So today, we have the unified theory of evolution, which integrates the different concepts into what is now widely accepted as how evolution is. So what are examples of these concepts? Well, Darwin put forth his ideas even before genes and genetics was even a thing, right? This photo here shows Gregor Mendel, who put forth his ideas on heredity after Darwin's time. So, of course, once the concept of genetics was established, scientists were able to connect Darwin's ideas with the concepts of genes and heredity. And, of course, surprisingly and very amazingly, Darwin's ideas were very much spot on, even if he had no idea of how genetics worked. So, this also operates on the basis of traits being heritable, right? For a trait to be passed on to offspring, there has to be some genetic component to the trait. It has to be in the genes before it's passed on, simply put. And this makes sense, right? Because not all changes that happen to an individual can be passed on. For example, you get a tattoo on your arm. This doesn't mean that the change that happened to you, which is the tattoo, will be passed on to your kids. There's no genetic component to tattoos, right? Oh, and by the way, we're talking about an individual here, which is you. Evolution is not like that. Okay? Evolution happens to entire groups. It has to be an entire group that exhibits the changes. It's not just one organism. So, with this in mind, we can say that evolution also refers to the changes in phenotypic variation within a population. So, if you remember, we mentioned earlier, the definition on gradualism. And we also mentioned that the changes that happen to species isn't always gradual. Okay? Well, yeah, because sometimes quick and sudden changes happen to a species, which can lead to evolution or which can lead to changes. Okay? In this case, it's known as punctuated equilibrium. Okay? So in this theory, species are relatively stable in terms of traits for a long time. This stability is known as stasis. Okay? But, there are periods in history wherein that stasis is interrupted and rapid changes are seen in species, maybe even forming a distinct new species. Okay? So this is supported by the fossil record. And Darwin's ideas of small changes over long periods of time aren't always seen in fossils. Now, the one we mentioned earlier about natural selection. Of course, natural selection also plays a role in the unified theory of evolution. But, scientists believe that most of the changes that led to the formation of new species today isn't because of natural selection. It's true that some of them are. Okay, a lot of the species we have today are products of natural selection. But more of them are probably because of genetic drift. I'm sure you're already familiar with this term. Genetic drift is the change in phenotypic variations or allele frequencies in a population because of random chance or random occurrences. So if in natural selection, these changes are because of adaptations that give an advantage, in genetic drift, it's just random. No adaptations. It's just pure chance. Okay? So if you're having a hard time visualizing genetic drift, imagine a population of fish with different scale colors. Let's say we have red-scaled fish and blue-scaled fish, all residing in one pond. Okay, so an example of genetic drift is when a flood randomly kills off all the members of that fish with a specific scale color. So let's say that the red-scaled fish all died. This means that allele frequencies shift to that of the remaining color, which is blue. So this shows genetic drift, since the survival of the blue population and the death of the red population doesn't have to do with the traits that they possess. It's just random chance of the flood killing off the reds. Before we move on, let's just dispel some misconceptions about evolution. Okay? First off, evolution is not teleological. Okay? This means that evolution does not have a set goal. There's no invisible hand, guiding a species to become the best that they can be. Evolution just happens, either by chance in genetic drift or through natural selection with adaptations, right? There's no force that drives species to be better. So if you played the game Spore, I don't know if you're old enough to have played this game. Okay? This is an example of what evolution is and what it isn't. So in this game, you start off as a single-celled organism, eventually becoming multicellular, and then you form tribes, and then you eventually gain, intelligence, and you fly off into space in the end. And that's how all your gameplay runs go, with a goal of becoming an intelligent species. That is not what evolution is. Okay? Evolution does not have a goal of producing intelligent species. So it's safe to say that us humans are not the pinnacle of evolution. Okay? So we mentioned this earlier. Evolution has to happen to an entire group, not just individuals. Why? Well, we'll explain more later on, specifically in the context of shifting allele frequencies. So, if one morning you wake up and you find out that you have, wings or horns, that doesn't mean you evolved. You're just weird. Okay? And Also, evolution doesn't happen in a single lifespan. Okay? Evolution in Pokemon, for example, is not evolution. If the changes happen within one lifespan, that's more akin to metamorphosis. Evolution in Pokemon is more of metamorphosis. Okay? The changes in evolution don't happen in a single lifespan, but rather across generations.